Thank you, Pat. Good morning, everyone. As Pat teed things up, the topic today is effective management of operational risks and an understanding of those various risks throughout the organization. The panel will discuss and explore the benefits of control rationalization for managing those risks, excuse me, and provide some insights based on their experience. So let me introduce the group. Kelly Beachenbach, Head of Control Assurance at First Citizens Bank. Patricia Catharino, Senior Vice President, Head of Risk Management and Internal Controls at Itaú, U.S. and Caribbean. Varun Agarwal, Director of Enterprise Risk for Western Alliance Bank. And Seth Rosenzweig, he is a partner for the National Integrated Risk Technology and Enterprise Practice. So good morning. Thank you all for joining. So let me start with a broad overview. What does operational risk mean to you in the context of control rationalization? So, and I'll pick, Varun, let me pick on you first.
So I'll just talk from my experience. So one thought that has come to, and we have actually faced is, you have operational risk and you have vendors, as part of your vendor risk management, as part of your operational risk. Now within vendor risk, have you really thought about stress testing the vendor risk controls that are really not your internal controls, that are your external controls, and for which you have no control over? So that's something that if there's a cyber event at a vendor and they have your data, how are you rationalizing your control environment internally, that you have not thought about, on that front? Another example I'll tell you is, the risk appetite, and this is something, that's set by the board. And yeah, it's approved, set by the board, but how does it really filter down to the ground level? I'm a loan officer, I'm opening an account. Have I thought about, giving privacy statements to my customer that is required by compliance, by law? And there is no control over that. There is no assessment over that. And have I incorporated those, because my board doesn't talk about, my board risk appetite really doesn't talk about, grassroots risk appetite metrics. Those are two examples I really want to start with, here.
Right. Okay. Seth, from your perspective.
Yeah, I would say as the loan operational technologist on the panel, I view it more so from a how am I identifying, measuring, and monitoring key operational risks to running my business. Like I'm sure we're all familiar with the different risk domains, but when it comes to operational risk, that to me needs a bit more sophistication, and I would also say a narrowing or a opening, but in this case, a narrowing of an aperture around how you're running your business, what matters, and the time in which it takes you to identify an incident. And so from a GRC perspective, from an enabling technology perspective, and I like to think of that as integrated risk in an application architecture and a data component, is how are you doing those things? How am I sourcing enough data? How am I storing enough data? How am I analyzing it? And how am I reporting it so that I can at least understand where I need to focus my efforts?
Patricia.
From my side, I do think that everything starts with a really good risk culture. First line, second line, third line defense, really well structured, and people understanding their roles and responsibilities. And with that, you cannot talk about a control optimization if you don't have a good identification and prioritization of your risks and controls. So everything is tight. You need to have your risk culture, then a good risk appetite that it's defined and it is thought of across the whole organization, and then a good mapping of your controls and risks. For then you'll be able to decide how you're gonna make your controls more optimal.
Kelly.
I think all of that's great. And just building upon that, I do think that control rationalization is the holy grail that people talk about in terms of what is that value add relative to everything that's been described here, which is I think all of you would agree, a tremendous amount of work just to get to a place where you have reliably documented risks and controls in a platform where you can harvest that data and or, as we heard earlier, use some more advanced technology, including AI-based, to really inform you. I've definitely, aspired to control rationalization. I think of controls as basically, hungry mouths that want to be fed. For every control that you have, there is care and feeding for that. And so ideally, kind of pointing out what Seth was saying, when you can really focus on those key controls and give them the most care and feeding, ensuring that your key indicators are informing you of whether or not they're operating within your tolerance, taking action quickly and having a plan for what that action is if they should, breach a tolerance. You're going to have much more success focusing on a critical few versus the critical few plus the unimportant many. Because, for every control that you have documented and identified, there's going to be a stakeholder, including your regulators, that are going to expect you to do something productive about that.
So Kelly, picking up on that point, you, Patricia, Varun all mentioned about the importance of controls. And we've often heard about continuous control monitoring as it relates to the technology platform systems and things of that nature. How do you rationalize and evaluate non-IT, non-system related controls on an ongoing basis, and how often do you do that?
So from a controls assurance perspective, it really does come back down to that bottoms up, process-based risk and control inventory, and it needs to be anchored on the common taxonomy that you have for all of your non-financial risks, and anchored on your businesses, your financial hierarchy, your business processes, your business process taxonomy. That's the framework that will ensure that you are at least acknowledging all of the areas that generate risk. As to its materiality and the ultimate financial impact, reputation impact, strategic impact, that has to be quantified in a systematic, uniform way so that when you're stack ranking your risks and your controls, you really know where you're spending your time.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yes.
I agree. I think that the key word here is prioritization, and you need to understand what your risks that are more relevant. Because if you want to update and review everything at the same time, it's going to be impossible, and then you don't focus on what is important and relevant for your stakeholders. So it is really important that you have a common taxonomy, because you can use that to make sure that different areas and different business, they are talking about the same thing, and they are not comparing things that are different. And then you can have a proper definition of control environment and what is your inherent risk, right? So I think that you need to understand the total and then define which are the ones that are more relevant for you to attack, depending on what is happening, even on this new environment, what kind of risks that are relevant for you at that moment.
That's right.
I wanted to add a little bit different view of what you should not be doing. So this is again from my experience. I was at an insurance banking, giant actually in my previous role, and we used to do RCSAs once a year. And it became, no, this RCSA, we're not really, it's too late, when we find the problem. So let's do it quarterly. So we started rolling it out quarterly. And it had the exact opposite effect. It became a check in the box process. It's like came to my desk and said, damn, I have to do it again. So let's just look what I did last quarter, and let me just see what I can tweak just to see that I've done it, then check in the box. And everybody was happy. Hey, we are doing it quarterly. We are more aware. But actually, it was absolutely the opposite effect, because it became an academic exercise. Audit was happy. Regulators are happy. Now you talk about, the March crisis of liquidity and, all that funding. And those were the exact issues that were not captured in our RCSAs because we were really focused on what happened in the past. We were just doing a check in the box. And that's when we really, had a moment like, wow, this process is not working. That's just my experience there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you must have been reading my questions. It begs the next question. Is the RCSA process, is it still relevant today, or does it need to be tweaked and tuned?
I'll just give one line answer, then I'll say, is it really informing the risk? That should be the question that we should be asking. So you're doing all these RCSAs. Is it really telling us the big risk picture that we really should be aware? That should be the fundamental question.
Yeah, I would say what I consistently, so I think you go through your RCSA. I think what's missing in a lot of institutions is data to back it up. Like I want my risk managers to, they're professionals. They have judgment that no computer, at least today, is going to have unless it's learned. But that's why we hired risk managers. So I do want an assessment based upon the inherent risk without controls as to what I should worry about. And then obviously, after you add controls, and everybody knows you've got residual risk. But I want that. But I think what's missing, I see this in a lot of institutions, is I'm not doing anything with that, or I'm too heavily reliant on controls. Again, I'll go back to the aperture. I don't know, in some of the banks that I deal with, there's billions of records produced, in a short period of time, or in a period of time. I don't know of any organization. We were talking about this when we were prepping before. I don't know if a sample of 25 or 45 is really going to get to the billion record problem that I may have because of my credit card population and the number of swipes. So I need to inform that with data. It doesn't need to replace, and working for a traditional audit organization in PwC, I have a lot of auditors who get nervous that your traditional controls environment may go away if I rely too heavily on data. And my answer is always, I use data to inform questions I'm going to ask. Yeah. So if I see a trend, and whether you do AI or whether you do your standard rules analytics, at least I need to inform if something is high risk, and I have an assessment to say yay or nay on whether how I move forward. I think there's not, and I heard the other panel, there's not enough integration with your application architecture, with your processes, with people, and with your data to say, credit cards seem really interesting. I've noticed some anomalous behavior. I'm using credit cards as an example, but I noticed some anomalous patterns that somebody detected. Maybe I should point my smartest people or systems at that. So I would say it needs to evolve, and it really hasn't evolved in many of the larger institutions that I'm part of. And I think it's an important part to not waste your human beings' time, because who wants to, I always say, if you came back and everything was green, that's great, but maybe I didn't segment that risk with enough effort to say, should I be looking further?
I think that's excellent. I don't think that the need for risk identification, quantification, assessment is going away. But I do think that we need to continue to innovate and think about the best way to use our people's time in that process, and the appropriateness of the frequency, the materiality thresholds that we should be looking at, so that we're not really staring at the wrong problems when there's something really staring us in the face that we're just not paying enough attention to because we're too busy, rolling out and performing sort of a perfunctory process. So gotta have those thought leaders that, to Seth's point, really spotlight the areas that could have a material impact on the company. Having recently lived through the Silicon Valley Bank exercise, I think I can say that, with a high degree of certainty, that risk identification and assessment is not going away, but the way in which we perform it needs to continue to improve.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think that we are going to keep doing risk assessments. but how we do it needs to change. So one of the things that we try to do, for example, we have an annual process, but we call that a live document, and we feed the analysis of the control environment with data that we have. Not necessarily we have all the best data available, because I think that everybody has a lot of systems. But you can put together, create indicators for the most relevant risks that you have, and then with those indicators, you can look at the trend to see if your risk is the same or not. The same for audit issues or regulatory requirements. If the process is relevant or not for your business continuity plan. So I think that you can put everything together and have a good assessment. And I will insist, it's also really important that the first line, and you have a good risk culture that people can see, okay, this is happening. I have already 3 assessments or 3 tests or a regulatory issue here. This is not as good as I thought it was, so I need to review and then maybe strengthen my controls here.
I think that agility is hugely important, because if you're too baked into the risk and control self-assessment process and you're just waiting for the months to tick away on the clock until it's time to do it again, that is in fact where the RCSA will be not the value add that you're looking for it to be. And to Patricia's point about what are those triggers that cause you to go back, and predefining those triggers, whether it's, you know, a large process change, you're in-housing something that used to be outsourced, you're outsourcing something that is in-house, your key indicators, you have new issues, you're, you know, there are ways in which to predetermine when a risk and control environment should be reassessed, including retested, right? We haven't talked about control testing, but in doing that, you help the first line really understand that thinking of this business environment analysis. How does that relate to my control environment? How should I be reevaluating and, you know, really redocumenting what is relevant today that is about to be in the rearview mirror tomorrow? And then, you know, I would just say as a second line, you can back test that, right? Because you should also know what is changing, and you can be holding the first line accountable. To Bill Smirnoff's points earlier, you know, the second line's teeth are to say, have you risk assessed this? Have you refreshed your risk assessment? How is the control environment changing as a result of these business environment factors? And what do you think about that?
You know, the other thing I would just quickly add to what you both were saying is, again, taking an operation/technology view, is we're also beholden to the technology that we use, and I'm finding that it's a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a seesaw, but at both ends of the line. On one side, many of my clients want to have their own risk assessment, RCSA, and they even rename RCSA, and it's a whole workflow. And many of the application and the application architectures don't support that workflow. And as a risk manager, there's a big debate, as everyone probably knows, is do we do out of the box? Do we do custom? Custom's a cost, so now what do I do? And on the other side is, I would argue, many of the processes may not be critical. So I think the challenge as operations and risk professionals is to say, how do I strike that balance between judgment I'm using in an RCSA process, beholden to an application, and hopefully not spreadsheets, but beholden to an application or a set of applications, but also to be nimble enough. And there's not a great answer other than it begs the question, is the process, is the juice worth the squeeze? Do I need to shrink it? Or is a regulator saying, nope, thou shalt do self-assessment? So now I have to talk to my technology providers to say, add a module of self-assessment and leave the application. But I think it's one worth having the discussion when you're planning an implementation on a new RCSA module or a new risk module, to say, oh, should I look at my processes first to make sure they're right sized for my organization? And then I can think about how I want to outlay that, how I want to process that.
So Seth, digging a little bit deeper on the point that you made earlier, you talked about the credit card swipes and millions, if not billions, of records of data. How do you make sure, to your point earlier about the sample size, that it's the right sample size? Because you can sample 100 records, but if it's against 2 billion, it's not relevant. So I'm curious what the group thinks about that, and where does technology, and it's on everybody's mind today, AI, come into all that?
Yeah, so I would say the question is less of a controls question. It's more of a large sample size, transactional based testing, which to me, I would argue everyone in this room should be doing should be varying their testing. That's, testing 101. But I think far too often there's a heavy reliance based on controls. Thou shalt have controls, and audit shall do it, and management obviously should own their controls. All good. But if you're not in large sample sizes, especially high transaction processes, one must be thinking more about a data architecture and how whether they're putting their data in the cloud, whether they're building a data lake, a swamp, a traditional relational database, whatever it may be. I would argue it's the age-old question, data quality. But I would also say it's around data ingestion. Like, how are you thinking about these large data sets that allow me to ask questions of the data? I think it's the biggest underinvestment. And in fact, many of the largest banking institutions are now getting consent orders about data. It used to be a footnote. A footnote would say, by the way, also work on your data governance. But think about BCBS 239 if you're familiar with it. Like, there's a whole view, which is basically good data governance with good technical architecture and making sure you tie out your source to target. I'm at a high level. But to me, if there's an underinvestment in risk technology, there's more of an underinvestment because data is a business asset. It's not a technical asset. So the answer to my view on your question is, one must think about the data that resides in the organization, how one is sourcing it, how one is storing it, how one is cleaning it, and how one is eventually using it. And I think every single business owner needs to be held accountable for that in their risk ecosystem as part of their data infrastructure.
Kevin, so on that AI piece that you mentioned, and to Seth's point, again, by examples, so there's a lot of fraud assessment, fraud detection, right? And again, by way of example, I was at a company, it was an insurer and a bank combined again. You took a picture and so what happened is you had an accident, an auto accident. So all the customer need to do is take a picture and send it over, and within 2 hours, he or she will be given the claim. How did that happen? That happened because of AI and data. So they had, and who built the model? Actually, Google built the model for us. It cost about $6 million to build that model. And there was a lot of debate, is it a good model or not? And that really happened on what you talk about sampling, and the data is, you have tens of thousands of accidents. They put it in the database, and then they actually, the point was to give the claims, the other was to detect fraud claims. Is it a real accident, or is it something that the customer has done it to make a claim, And that was purely, again, we talk about the buzzwords AI analytics, but this is really and it really reduced our operational risk for fraud, because we didn't have the capability to build the model. I mean, Google had all the data. We hired them, they built it, and bam, it was. So AI is absolutely viable. It is something that we can put in place. It's just to recognize where it is and what's the value.
So before we open up for questions, I'll just pose another final question to each of the panelists here. Where do we go in the next 3 years, 5 years? Where is this headed? We've got a lot of emerging technologies. We have a lot of best practices under development. Where are we sitting here 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 8 years from now? So Varun, let me start with you.
No, I'm a big believer in, I'll repeat just what I just said, is analytics. What kind of analytics are you doing, and at the grassroots level? And again, what you're doing at the grassroots level, is it really is there a communication from top down to top down to bottom up. Is there a good handshake, or what the people are doing and your employees are doing at the bottom level, the top senior management is really not informed of. That bridge can be combined with data and analytics. I truly believe in that.
Seth?
I would say just maybe the 15-second anecdote is my firm, there was a public settlement that we had with the SEC years ago. The head of assurance called me. I was running GRC. Before I was running GRC, I was running our analytics financial services program. I only say that because in my GRC role, the head of assurance called me and said, we have an SEC settlement. We said we would improve our GRC. So can you improve our GRC? And I said, sure, but why? What are you trying to solve? He said, well, this can't happen again. Partners can't do things on audit clients. And I said, well, that's not going to be a GRC problem. It's going to be an analytic problem and an integrated risk problem. And while it could be a bit hackneyed and common to say integrated risk, I think that's the future. I mean, I was happy that I was asked to lead our GRC program as a data person, because I thought that was always missing, that I would not want to pick up GRC if we didn't have an analytics component. I think with all of the, obviously the AI, the ChatGPT, that's an obvious component of if machines can do it faster than humans, great. But I think the integration of that in organizations is the most important thing that I see in the future.
I agree. I think that what is data is the most relevant thing that is going to happen in the next years. And the use of technology and how we understand and use this data. So not only internal data, but even external, considering what he said at the beginning, third party, how our third party are using our data and how what are the data that they have as well. So you need to also monitor their risks. So I think that it's data analytics and how we use this data in an efficient way.
I would agree, and I'll just offer a few proof points to these statements. One is, if you look at fraud, if you look at BSA, AML, anti-money laundering, detection capabilities, just as two examples, those areas have received a tremendous amount of focus over, really multiple decades, but, certainly fraud over multiple decades, AML, at least for the past decade and a half to 2 decades. And what you really don't hear about anymore are huge gotcha fraud losses or huge AML issues. Now, obviously, there's an asterisk on that because these things still happen. It comes down to culture, and it comes down to the ability to detect and prevent. But if you take the focus that has been on data, transactional data, data analytics, the capability to harvest that data, analyze it, and quickly trigger when there's an anomalous event and detection of a risk that is about to happen versus has already happened. If you can translate that to the other non-financial risks, security is another area where this is very much in play. You will really have scaled the technology and the capabilities such that the risk will truly be manageable and you will actually get the value out of your investments that you're expecting. Why? Because there will be very few surprises.
Thank you. So we're standing between everybody and lunch, but we've got a minute or two left. Any questions from the audience?
There's one there.
Somebody over there?
My company is right now in a process, which I'm not part of it. Unfortunately, I really would like to be, but they started like a project where they want every single employee to submit ideas or where the company has a risk. And from there, I wanted to ask you, do you think that there should be maybe artificial intelligence or anything? Because I can see thousands and thousands of ideas that should be analyzed for a risk assessment, which is not my best idea. So what is your approach after this project is going?
I'll jump in. So I just want to make sure I understand your question. So you've asked how many employees in the company? 5,000. You've asked 5,000 employees to list their top risks, and you're going to take that, analyze it, and see if it informs your risk assessment. And then your question is, should you use technology to help segment that, analyze that, and to inform?
Yeah, I'm thinking that first of all, at some point, they are going to say internal audit take over.
Yeah.
They haven't done yet, but I know it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm preparing myself for that.
Yeah.
Thinking that how we are going to approach to respond agile to these type of requests. Okay. I want to think what is the best way to do it, what should be, maybe if there is a technology out there that is going to help us complete this project of risk assessment using all that data. In the past, we normally use executives to prepare the risk assessment. This time is going to be with all these ideas from employees.
Yeah, so I would say as a non-lawyer, non-C-suite risk professional, again, I don't know what you're going to collect, so I would leave that up to the risk professionals, lawyers in the room. But I would say from a technology perspective, certainly, like you're going to get a lot of information. I do think you need to be able to centralize that, analyze that. I mean, all the things you would use with technology and bump that up against, how do you quantify that based on all the different data points you're getting? I absolutely, and I think it's a great idea to be asking. I mean, you're almost crowdsourcing, like, when people don't speak up, they don't speak up because they're fearful of retribution. So to me, I think that's a really nice answer to say, tell me about something I'm missing. And it can inform your risk models. Again, I'm not saying that from an operational risk perspective, but I do think it does help inform a model that maybe you haven't thought about that before. I don't know if anyone else on the panel agrees, disagrees.
I'll just say, just benchmark it to something, So you're doing it internally. How are you comparing it? I mean, your peers may not have done it, but there should be you should be able to benchmark it as well. It's just your internal data, but how are you comparing it to externally? That's also important as part of your assessment.
Well, I think we're getting the hook from Pat.
That turned red. That turned red, Kevin.
That turned red.
Oh, yeah. Get out then.
Well, thank you, everybody. Very much appreciate your knowledge, your willingness to contribute. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.